Okay. Hello and welcome. We're delighted to have you join us today. My name is Amber Bryant, and I'm the project manager for the Partnership for Expanding Education Research in STEM, or PEERS, Data Hub at the University of Michigan. The PEERS Data Hub is funded by the National Science Foundation and is a collaborative initiative between the American Educational Research Association, AERA, and the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, ICPSR, here at the University of Michigan. The PEERS Data Hub features ways to explore and discover data sets for secondary research and analysis, avenues for connecting with colleagues and like-minded researchers, and resources for data and research management. If you would like to know more and also to register for webinars such as this one for free, please visit us at the PEERS Data Hub website at www.peersdatahub.net. A few quick technical notes before we get started today. This webinar will be recorded, and when the recordings and slides are available, a message will be sent to you via email. We hope this doesn't happen, but if the webinar were to close unexpectedly, please reopen it from the link you used to attend this presentation. We welcome your questions. Please type in questions at any time using the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. A live transcript and closed caption is available. To show or hide the live transcript, click the up arrow on the live transcript button. Please note, for those who are viewing on a phone or a tablet, the Zoom app currently highlights only the active speaker. The live transcript will still be available. You may need to scroll to the left or the right to see the presenter or the presentation. For privacy, all participants are in listen-only mode, with microphones muted, and chat between participants is unavailable, or it should be. One last note, if you are posting to social media about what you learned here today, please use hashtag PEERS Data Hub. Once again, this webinar will be recorded and a link will be sent to you via email. Let's go ahead and get started. Today, we are hearing from 4 research scholars who work in various areas of learning analytics. I've included the agenda in the chat for your convenience. Here's the link for that. First, we will hear from Dr. Ben Motz. He is the director of the e-learning research and practice lab and research sciences in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Indiana University. He will be talking with us today about what learning analytics is and some of his recent research. After that, we will hear from Rene Kizilcec, an assistant professor of information science at Cornell University, who will be talking to us about intervention research and education. We will hear from Wang, assistant professor in computer science and engineering here at the University of Michigan, and she will be discussing student solutions to support learning at scale. Lastly, our final speaker will be James Russell, Senior Director of Research Support and Assurance at Unizin. Unizin is a higher education consortium focused on improving learning experiences by providing digital teaching and learning resources. I would like to say thank you in advance to all of our speakers, as well as our ASL, closed captioning, and IT support. And I look forward to a lively discussion with our attendees. Dr. Ben Motz, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Amber. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm going to try sharing my screen now. Here we go.
All right.
You should see some slides.
Yeah, you're awesome.
Okay. Thank you again. I've attended and been interested in what PEERS is doing over time. I think it's spectacular. I'm going to go ahead and dive in because we've got so much awesomeness to discuss. And I think I'm going to start with an analogy that for at least me as a learning researcher has been really instructive when thinking about learning analytics, even though it's a little bit weird. Okay, we all know about this thing that we call fire. The definition of fire is basically oxidation. It's combustion in which substances combine chemically with oxygen from the air and give off heat. And if we take this as our definition of fire, and hey, I got this directly from the dictionary, we do get into some weird territory. So for one, if we stick to our definition, then rusting metal is an example of fire. Rust is also oxidation. It's caused by chemical interaction with oxygen in the air, and it also gives off heat just like way more slowly than we'd normally consider for something that we'd call fire. And if we take the alternative approach and say, no, fire has to be fast, it has to be bright, and it has to emit light, then like wafting embers or sparks from a firework could be considered fire, but those are really just like incandescent particles and don't really conform with the substance of what we would consider to be fire. So in other words, we should probably accept that the definition of fire would include some things that might not look like fire. And I think the same goes for learning analytics. So the established definition of learning analytics, which has stuck around since it was first coined, is that learning analytics is the measurement, collection, analysis, and reporting of data about learners and their contexts for purposes of understanding and optimizing learning in the environments in which it occurs. And if you're a learning researcher like me, you might think, hey, that sounds a lot like what I do. So if we adopt this definition, then weird things happen. Practically all learning research becomes an element of learning analytics. And if instead we take the alternative approach and define learning analytics by the sorts of things that are characteristic of learning analytics products like dashboards or risk models, then we might be missing the substance of these efforts. So in other words, I think we should accept that, believe it or not, pretty much all of the learning research, all learning research is contained under the umbrella of the current definition of learning analytics. And to give you an example, a local example, I'm going to do something monumentous here in this webinar. I'm going to put a stake in the ground and claim that the first learning analytics research study was performed right here in Southern Indiana back in 1895. William Lowe Bryan had just come back from a fellowship with Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig, and he met a student at Indiana University named Noble Harder, who'd previously spent years working as a telegrapher on the Western Union Circuit. And over the next few years, Bryan and Harder tested novice telegraphers weekly on their rates of sending and receiving a message by Morse code. And they drew learning curves from the results. So here you see data that were collected at the Western Union office at Brookville, Indiana during the winter of 1895 to 1896 for a 17-year-old student named Edith Balsley. And they made these weekly tests every Saturday for 36 weeks and measured the speed of sending and receiving telegraphic messages using Morse code. And as noted by Bryan and Harder, in all cases, the sending curve rised more rapidly and more uniformly than the receiving curve from the beginning of practice right to the learner's maximum ability. This was explained by the fact that Edith knew the letters that she would be sending next, and this anticipation provided a speed advantage compared with the receiving rate. So it's worth noting this was the first drawing of a learning curve to appear in any scholarly literature. But I have a prediction, and that's that if Bryan and Harder ran the same study today and submitted it to the Learning Analytics and Knowledge Conference, the Core Learning Analytics Conference, it'd fit squarely within the conference's scope. So the distinguishing feature separating Bryan and Harder's work and contemporary learning analytics isn't the question they were asking, and it's not the theory that they were building or even the data that they were collecting. Rather, it was the difficulty with which the data were collected. So nowadays, the data that Bryan Harder worked for 3 years to collect are passively recorded by default at a population scale that would have been totally unimaginable in 1895. So in this way, the substance of learning analytics isn't all that different from other forms of learning research. But instead, the thing that's unique about learning analytics is that, and I'm going to quote here from the Society for Learning Analytics Research's website, is that learning analytics seeks to exploit the new opportunities once we capture new forms of digital data from students' learning activity. So in this regard, learning analytics privileges data that are passively recorded in digital learning platforms supporting natural learning environments like classes and stuff. And I should add here something else that separates learning analytics from learning research is that learning analytics community includes computer scientists and IT administrators and data architects, and they all kind of bring an entrepreneurial spirit and an innovation, kind of a sense of innovation in building and piloting and developing that might be a little bit different from the theoretical focus of traditional learning research. So with these new opportunities, I'm going to review 3 different items, but I think that there are many more that could potentially be reviewed. I'm going to talk about the opportunities using digital learning data to conduct research on these new data and find out what they mean. 2, to do research on the interventions that might be enabled by these data. And 3, to discuss how research on learning processes could incorporate these new data. And I don't want to suggest these are opportunities on its own and that don't have new challenges. By all means, this new digital learning data carries new challenges. For example, like who can access these data? Who owns the data? What biases exist in these data? Can learners opt out of data collection in the same way they might be able to opt out of an experimental research study? So navigating the new opportunities and everything I'm about to discuss will also involve navigating these new challenges. So let's start with research on the new data sources. So the new data sources that are afforded by contemporary learning platforms are expansive, and it would take way more than my allotted time today to summarize all the different kinds of data. These range from student artifacts, like the online discourse and written work that students submit in response to discussion prompt or assignment, right down to granular student activity data passively recorded as students work through learning activities. This latter category is probably what most researchers would commonly associate with learning analytics, and it's sometimes referred to as trace data. There's been extensive research over the past 15 years that have demonstrated that a variety of different features and indices built from these trace data are reliably correlated with learning and course performance. Like there's a list of papers right there, typically more so than even educational background variables or demographic data. But I want to be clear, nobody in learning analytics believes that additional clicks all by themselves cause improvements in learning and course performance, right? Like that would be absurd. You can't just tell a student to click more to boost outcomes. Instead, it's generally accepted that indices derived from trace data might provide some indirect evidence of psychological constructs that may also be related to learning and course performance. And to take it a step further, clearly, student activity interacts with instructional design, social support, goal orientation, and so on. And some of these external factors might also be inferred from the new data sources. So really, in my opinion, it's one of the key strengths of the new data sources associated with learning analytics, being able to potentially assess relevant constructs and factors at a full population scale that would otherwise require things like elaborate surveys and focus groups and other time-intensive methods. So once one has a sense of the relevant activity index that is applicable to an instructional design or a research study, you start to be able to do some cool things. So just as a simple example, one of the most effective methods for improving student performance is to provide feedback. That's well known. If a student submits their work in class, it's relatively natural for a teacher to acknowledge the student's effort, perhaps by saying something like, "Good job." And research has shown that providing this kind of positive feedback improves compliance with homework assignments. But when a student submits their work online, that doesn't happen. It's often like dropping your hard work into a dark well, and there's no acknowledgement or confirmation of the effort that you'd invested. Heck, even academic journals will email you a submission confirmation when you submit your manuscript, but that just doesn't happen with learning management systems. So at Indiana University, we've been piloting an intervention platform, which we call Boost, that enables reminders and feedback directly triggered by students' state in a learning management system. And we find that simple notifications that deploy praise when a student submits their work online caused students to increase their assignment submission rates and increase their course grades relative to no feedback and other forms of immediate feedback. So this right here is just an appetizer. It's like an amuse-bouche. And the real expert here is Rene, who in a moment will be talking about behavioral science in the context of learning analytics. But I just wanted to share this example of how one could leverage this bold frontier of new opportunities in digital platforms to conduct research on learning interventions and record authentic learning outcomes and advance theory at scale. Because that's the juice, right? Like that's really a major goal of learning research, learning analytics or otherwise, to understand and optimize learning in the environment, in the education environments, in the settings where it occurs. And here's where I think learning analytics characterized by the new opportunities in digital learning platforms can have some of the brightest impact. If we're going to understand and optimize learning in earnest, we'll need to ask questions at really grand scales, examining how the practices and designs and materials and interventions and all the range of teaching moves cause improvements in student learning, or in other words, figure out what X causes Y. Inferring these causal relationships and generalizing these relationships to new education settings and systems is really, that's like the paramount goal of theoretical research. But in education, this scale is lacking. To test the generalizability of a finding, what you need to do is you need to run the same study in a new setting, or in other words, to conduct a replication. And in 2014, Matt Mockel and Jonathan Plucker published a Searing review where they found that replication studies were exceedingly rare in education, rarer than in other fields. And when these replication studies were conducted, the findings just aren't particularly robust. Like half of published replications carried out independently from the original author find evidence that's consistent with the original findings. Not so good. So I want to be clear about where I'm heading. Traditionally, an education researcher might run an experiment in a single class, observe some finding, and consider case closed. Building theory from small-scale one-off studies like this is notoriously prone to idiosyncratic confounds. If we want to build theory that generalizes or to test the generalizability of theory, we really need to run experiments at much larger scales, potentially including dozens of diverse classes spanning demographics and institutions and curricula. Such large-scale experimental research is like modestly more feasible nowadays with these large-scale digital learning platforms. And with some incredible colleagues, we've recently published the first example of this kind of research that we're aware of using a model that we call many classes. In this first many classes study, what we did was we conducted an experiment on feedback timing by manipulating at the student level when students would see feedback on practice quizzes that were part of their routine learning activities in college courses. So to be clear, students were randomly assigned in a within subject design to have their feedback delayed by a few days after they clicked, you see at the top, the submit quiz button in Canvas, or to get immediate feedback as soon as they click submit, which would be the screen on the right. You'll have to take it from me that the appropriate timing of feedback has been a matter of active debate in the learning research literature for a long time. Very old findings like B.F. Skinner stuff suggests that feedback should always be administered as soon as possible, but more recent research has found benefits for delays. So rather than running this research contrast in one class, what we did was we ran this contrast in over 36 classes distributed across 15 different college campuses and thousands of students. I should add that some of these classes were also assigned at random to incentivize students to look at their feedback with follow-up assignments that ask students questions about the feedback they received. And what we did was we then collected students' behaviors and their grade outcomes, as well as moderator values describing each instructor's unique implementation of the experiment. This scale was awesome. And the data sharing that it required was made possible by the Unizin consortium. And you'll hear from James Russell in a moment, who provides these data services that bring disparate learning systems together into a common format. So at this point, you might be wondering what the heck we found with such a crazy step. So across 38 classes, we found no broadly generalizable difference in learning performance when students received immediate feedback compared with delayed feedback. Importantly, it's not that there's uncertainty in this episode, rather we see, estimate. Instead, we see an estimate of the effective feedback timing that's like tight around 0. So the next question becomes, are there properties of the students or the instructional designs that may have moderated these benefits? So using the opportunities that were provided by the fact that this experiment was implemented in the LMS, we extracted data on dozens of potential moderator values, and we found some interesting patterns. So first, we found evidence that on the left, in classes where viewing feedback was incentivized, there was a slightly stronger advantage for delayed feedback when there were more quizzes. And across all classes on the right panel, you can see that we found evidence that bigger delays conferred bigger advantages for delayed feedback, perhaps because it was helping students space their study and reflect on past work from a new perspective. And while these interactions admittedly didn't reach the threshold that we'd set for statistical inference, they came pretty close, and they were likely underpowered, considering that we really only had 38 data points at the class level. So to continue to advance this kind of research, we're going to need tools that make experimental research more accessible and more practical across a wider range of education settings. And that's really all I worry about nowadays. That's my main focus nowadays. And if you don't mind me making a personal plug, I'm happy to share with you that we've recently announced a tool that you could learn more about if you want, called Terracotta, funded by Schmidt Futures and now the Institute of Education Sciences. Terracotta is an experiment builder that's currently integrated with the Canvas LMS, allowing a teacher or a researcher in collaboration with the teacher to randomly assign different versions of online learning activities to students, collect informed consent, and export de-identified study data. Terracotta is a portmanteau of tool for educational research with randomized control trials. And the goal is basically to make it easier to conduct more rigorous and responsible educational research at scale. So clearly, a lot has changed since Brian and Harder's first learning analytics study. I hope I've made the case today that many of these basic questions remain the same, but the opportunities for data and intervention and scale are what makes learning analytics a particularly compelling means of approaching these questions. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. I'll hand it back to Amber.
Awesome. So I did receive one question. Well, actually, I have two for you. How can your research inform pre-service teacher programs?
Oh, that's cool. Like, how can we take the data that we find in the classroom and feed it forward to people who are beginning teachers? Yeah, I think that there's a lot of opportunity to build more robust practice guides about topics that might be of special theoretical or practical relevance. So as we're thinking about the next many classes study, really, instead of thinking about the final product being a scholarly research article, instead we're imagining what kind of practical guidance we might be able to produce that would support a teacher knowing, okay, this is the way that you might implement an instructional intervention, and here are the pockets where there's improvements. So I think that's a great question. Yeah, it actually applies broadly to learning analytics. Like, how can we carry what we observed in a classroom or in a research study forward so that it generalizes to new settings?
There's one that popped up in the Q&A. Does the fact that all types of feedback center around 0 make you consider other options for intervention or feedback, or other types of feedback? And if so, which?
So I want to be very clear. The thing that centered on 0 was the effect of manipulating the timing of feedback. And I also want to be super clear that the thing that centered on 0 was the global estimate. So it's nevertheless still possible that in any individual class, there's a robust effect of delaying feedback or providing feedback immediately. And the point of many classes is the observation that it depends on what the instructional design might be and the implementation in the class. Being able to assess what's going on across, an institution's worth of classes and then infer the effects of learning is really what I think the key strengths are of learning analytics. So yeah, I want to be cautious against saying that nothing matters. It's instead, I think things depend. But rather than saying everything depends on everything and it's like Wild West and nobody can figure out anything, I think that learning analytics has an opportunity to start investigating those dependencies.
And for the sake of your research, how are you defining feedback, or what counts as feedback?
Oh, in that study, it was operationalized as whatever the teacher wanted. So that was one of the variables that we actually considered to be relevant to the effective feedback, whether it was elaborative feedback where the teacher said, hey, this is wrong because X, Y, and Z, or if it was corrective feedback, like here's the right answer, or if it was just the grade. So whatever the teacher would have provided as feedback, that was what we considered to be released immediately or delayed. It's a good question.
Gotcha. Thank you. And for the sake of time, we will have a Q&A session at the end with all the our speakers today. We're going to move on to our next speaker and save our some of these questions for our last Q&A session. So just because I didn't answer now does not mean I would not get to you all. So thank you, and please continue to type your questions in the Q&A. Next up, we have Dr. Rene, who's an assistant professor of information science at Cornell University, and he will be talking about intervention research. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Amber. Can you hear me well?
Yes, sounds good.
Sounds good. Let me share my slides and start off by saying that I'm really glad to that you asked me to join for this session. I've been following Piers and I've been impressed with what you've been able to put together. Let me just try and share these slides. There we go. All right. Does that show up? Good. Thank you. So as Emma was saying, my name is Rene Kizilcec, and I'm at Cornell University. I direct a lab called the Cornell Future of Learning Lab, where we study everything at the intersection of education and technology, really. And learning analytics is a big part of that. And the definition of learning analytics that Ben provided is correct. It is a definition. It is a very broad definition. And I think over the last years that we've seen this field develop, we've seen a lot of movement in how people interpret learning analytics and what kinds of analyses they conduct. And it all started off with a lot of collection of data and understanding what we can make out of data that is collected passively or actively by various environments, and understanding how learning is happening in those environments. And I think more and more we've moved towards active intervention. And that is similar to what we've seen many, many years ago in medicine, where in medicine, we've started to look at data sets of what causes death and other diseases. And we've understood relationships, and more there was interest in understanding, well, how can we intervene in order to change some of these, in order to make changes? And so I think we're seeing something very similar happening in the learning analytics field, where there's more and more interest in the interventionist side of things, in collecting a lot of data, but also in intervening using experiments or quasi-experimental techniques in environments that make it easier to conduct such studies. And so that is what I'm going to be focusing on, the aspect of intervening using experiments. And what we've been seeing in the field right now is some scaling of what happens in, oh, sorry, here we go. Some scaling of what happens in the lab to the field. People have been taking intervention approaches, activity ideas that have been shown in lab studies to help students or to help teachers, and inserted them as experiments in courses to understand how they affect students at somewhat larger scale. I think one place where that became really popular was massive open online courses that not only brought together one of the most diverse classrooms that we've ever seen, with people from all over the world, with age ranges that usually are unobserved in any other classroom environment. But they also make it very easy to change something about how the environment looks, how the environment works, what feedback is provided in order to then understand the effects that it has on learners in those environments. And that has scaled up from there into other learning environments that are more for credit, that are more formal learning environments, such as online courses and in-person courses that use technology, which almost all courses now do in higher education. All of them use LMSs like Canvas or Blackboard. And so what we've seen is intervention approaches such as psychological or WISE interventions, self-regulated learning strategies, social support interventions, and others being implemented at large scale to learn about their external validity. Do they still work when we take them out of the lab and put them in the real world? And what kinds of estimates can we realistically expect once we put them into this messiness of the real world? The other aspect that this can provide is learning about heterogeneous treatment effects. How does this intervention affect people who are not like the people we can recruit in a lab study, but who are diverse? And how does it affect different groups of people in diverse samples? Finally, what it also allows us to look at is behavioral and other correlates of the treatment. So if we put in an intervention that motivates students to not procrastinate, do their homework earlier, what are the behavioral correlates that we can see that are related to the intervention that might tell us about whether this intervention is going to be successful down the line? These kinds of surrogate outcomes that allow us to detect successful interventions earlier can be very helpful in identifying successful interventions. They can also help us understand the mechanisms by which these kinds of interventions are working or not working once we put them in the field. And this is an area where learning analytics can be extremely helpful, because the collection of those kinds of data used to be much harder and had to be done very intentionally. Whereas in environments that collect a lot of different data about how students are interacting anyway, there's an opportunity to dive in an exploratory way into these correlations to understand the mechanisms that lead from the intervention to the final outcome of interest. Now, some examples of these done by my colleagues and myself include interventions that look at psychological threats in online environments that come up when students from all over the world come into an environment created in one country, in Western countries specifically, and looking at how we can close these global achievement gaps that have occurred in massive open online courses in terms of the completion rates between students in more and less developed countries. Some other work includes work on planning prompts, getting students to make concrete plans for how they're going to achieve what it is that they want to achieve in the course, maybe completion or finishing the first few weeks of a course. This also allows us to look at cultural variation when we look at people from different parts of the world and how they are affected by one and the same interventions. This has allowed us to understand where a self-regulation intervention can be more effective than another one, and what other strategies might need to be deployed in order to help students or learners who are in other parts of the world and living in different cultural contexts. It also allows us to understand how novel ways of visualizing information that these environments collect anyway can help students and can help teachers regulate. So there's been a lot of work in learning analytics on dashboards and the information that it can provide. And experiments can help us understand how dashboards affect students, how dashboards affect learners and instructors in these environments in order to support their students better or in order to support their own learning better. Now, but taking an intervention like this and putting it into one big course or two big courses is not enough. One of the issues is that this course might be unique in a number of different ways. And even though it is a large class and there is maybe thousands of students in it, it still is really just an N of one. It's just one classroom. So if we want to really scale these interventions and understand their properties and advance the theory of the context that matters around their effectiveness, we need to test them in many different courses or many different classes, which, as Ben was talking about, is part of the intention of the many classes studies. And so what this provides is it provides an ability to learn about the replicability of the effects. Does the effect work if we put it in a similar course again or in different courses? It allows us to learn about the contextual moderators of effects. Under what conditions does a certain intervention provide certain effects? And therefore advance our theoretical understanding, which is limited in many ways because of the limited samples that we were able to collect in the past. For instance, being able to only study samples or primarily study samples within the United States really limits our ability to understand what might happen with an intervention, with an approach in a different cultural environment. It allows us to learn a lot more about heterogeneous treatment effects because now we might have groups that were underrepresented in just one course scaled up to have them be large enough so that we can make robust claims about the effects on that group. It also allows us to learn a lot more about the behavioral and other correlates of treatment. Right? All of these claims can be now made with more robustness, with more strength, because we can observe these processes across many different environments and average out what is really working and what is more noisy than not. Finally, it also allows us to make recommendations about general policies. Right? If I try out an intervention in my course and it works well, can I really recommend that you use it in your course? It might not work because it is a different environment, it's a different classroom environment, and I only have an N of one really, even if my N of one included 1,000 students. But once we've tested something across hundreds of courses that are very diverse and it works reliably across those, that really provides a lot of strength for making these policy recommendations. And so we tried this in a recent study with a number of colleagues to scale up behavioral science interventions in online education. It's, we believe, one of the largest experiments of its kind. We went with a number of interventions across 247 courses. Over 250,000 students were exposed to these interventions and participated over 2.5 years, which allowed us to rigorously test some very well-established intervention approaches around self-regulation, around reducing psychological threats in course environments, across a large variety of courses that included STEM, non-STEM, courses developed by different institutions and for different audiences. And what we found is that more often than not, the interventions did not replicate. The interventions had very small effects, much smaller than what we found in the initial studies. Whereas there were some small effects early on, students were more engaged at the beginning of courses. Finding effects down the line in terms of course completion was very hard. And there were only a few circumstances where we were able to find those. Moreover, one of the biggest insights really from the study is just how hard it is to forecast what is going to work in a new course. So in this study, we had 4 waves of analysis where we had a semester, we pre-registered hypotheses for that semester. The interventions ran about 50 or so courses that semester. And then we looked at how they did. And we used that data to develop new hypotheses for the next semester where another 50 or so courses would run. And the most surprising thing was just how hard it was, based on very large data from 50 courses, to predict how these same interventions would do in the next 50 courses, some of which were the same ones, just run again, some of which were slightly different courses. And so it was a very humbling experience, seeing just how difficult it is to forecast whether an intervention is going to be effective in an environment in the future. And so I encourage you to take a look at this and draw your own conclusions about it. But to me, it really suggests the importance of scaling the same interventions across many environments and understanding the contextual features that moderate the effectiveness. And we did find a number of contextual features that mattered in this context, such as whether the course was prone to having a global achievement gap or not. Now, that study, as large and interesting as it was, also had a number of limitations in terms of what we were able to do. And those limitations are what inspired us to build a new socio-technical infrastructure that is worked together with Ryan Baker and Colm Howlin at Realize It. It is funded by Schmidt Futures, and it's called the Behavioral Intervention Research Infrastructure. It is an infrastructure that matches researchers who have ideas for interventions that might work in online courses in higher education with instructors and universities that have courses and that are open to trying out these interventions. And we match the two. We help implement these interventions based on the specifications of the researchers, and we provide de-identified data on the effects that it has in those courses for students who are taking them. Ryan Baker's team also is implementing affect detectors, which will allow researchers to look at how student affect varies as a result of these interventions, which is an important variable to study in real-world environments as a result of these interventions in education. And so the way it works, I just summarized here it is for the slides that I'm going to share later on. But survey data is also collected as part of this and allows researchers to understand who exactly is taking these interventions. It allows research to do cluster randomized trials as well. So there's a lot of possibilities, and we're inviting more researchers to join us and propose studies for the coming semesters. Now, I want to push the boundary a little bit of what we usually consider learning analytics. Learning analytics has the word learning really right center in front. And so one of the things that may not be quite the usual definition of learning is academic pathways. Students go through high school, they go through college, they go into careers, and on the way they take a number of courses, they make a number of choices that are really important, that are really deterministic for where they're going to end up in their career path. And what I would propose is that this is another area for learning analytics, sometimes called curriculum analytics, though it is somewhat different, to look more into and to really make part of the work that we do as a community. Because these choices are usually unobserved. We don't really understand how students make these choices, but they're incredibly influential in their learning progression as students go from one course to the next, and how they decide what careers they want to go into. The data for this is generally available. Existing SIS, Student Information System, and registrar data is available at most institutions and can be studied in order to understand how students are making these choices in their learning path. Other applications can be built in order to collect new data as to how students are considering. We proposed recently an example of how that might be done in order to provide students with information about course options, while also collecting data on what students are considering as they're making these choices, to close the loop on understanding what goes into their decision making. It especially provides opportunities for intervention to promote societal institutional goals along academic pathways, such as conveying descriptive norms about what pathways are normal. Students might not see that it's okay to take classes that they're just interested in and they're not maybe helping their career goals after all, but it's okay to follow their interests. Interventions around raising awareness of small courses that might be overlooked by students. Interventions to promote interest exploration in liberal arts degrees, and many more examples of that sort. And finally, if you permit me, I want to put in a plug for some of these kinds of studies where they're presented. I have the pleasure of hosting the ACM conference on learning at scale at Cornell Tech in 2022 in person, if it's allowed. And it'll be between June 1st and 3rd. And I invite all of you to come join us there on the new campus on Roosevelt Island. With that, I'll hand it back to Amber, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Rene. That was awesome. And I apologize about that, folks. The little technical glitch there. So we do have several questions for you in the Q&A. The first one is, can you please explain a little why the intervention works for individualist but not collective cultures? It's kind of towards the beginning of your presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. So the intervention was developed in 2 countries in the world. And it's been, although it has been tested many, many times in many different settings, including medical settings for physical activity, for getting flu shots, for getting people to vote, for many applications, all of those have only occurred, to our knowledge, in 2 countries, which are Germany and the United States, both of which are very Western, individualistic cultures compared to some of the collectivistic cultures that are very well represented in online courses, and also very well represented in the United States, looking at, for instance, Asian American immigrants or students from countries in Eastern contexts who come to the United States. And so our hypothesis is that the way it was conceptualized, the way that self-regulation was conceptualized in context, is more amenable to the Western context, where you can make plans about your goals and your obstacles and how to overcome your obstacles without having to worry too much about the people around you. Whereas in more collectivist cultures, it really matters what people around you are thinking and doing. And the idea that you could just plan with these if-then statements, what you're going to do and how you're going to overcome your obstacles is less acceptable. And we find survey evidence to suggest that indeed people in more Eastern cultures don't feel like that approach makes sense in their cultural context.
Gotcha. There's another question, and this one might even be something we could talk about towards the end. But if you want to speak a little bit about techniques or strategies from learning analytics that could be useful in qualitative research.
Yeah. That's a great question. So we are finding that the combination between the quantitative artifacts and qualitative research is incredibly rich as a sort of model for studying these things. So the example I showed you, that picture of the pathways, is something that my students developed looking at data of real students taking courses at Cornell, and they use these visualizations of students' pathways using an algorithm for creating them, and then take them to students at the university and ask them about these. And they use it as a technology probe in order to see how students feel about it, using semi-structured interviews, using surveys, and using other methods in order to get at students' perceptions and how they make sense of these data, that then reinforms the way that the algorithms are tuned and adapted to make it more intuitive for students to use.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm an education researcher myself, and I look more at economics and student outcomes, but mixed methods is the best way to get at any of it, honestly. So great answer, and thanks again. We're going to move along to our next presenter today, so we can keep it moving. We will hear from Wang, who is an assistant professor in computer science and engineering here at the University of Michigan, and she will be discussing solutions to support learning at scale. Wang, take it away.
Great, thank you, Amber. Can everyone hear me well? Okay, great. Let me. Great, thank you everyone. And I'm so thrilled to join the webinar today to discuss how data and analytics can benefit education. And thanks to the fantastic talks by Ben and Rene. I think their talks laid great foundations of learning, what is learning analytics, and there are all kinds of data sources and all kinds of analytics we can leverage to benefit education. And in this talk, I will be focusing on how we can use data and analytics to support instructors and educators in designing effective learning experiences. Specifically, we'll talk about one project where we harness student written solutions to generate scalable learning opportunities. We know that large numbers of people are seeking higher education and professional development. For example, people learn in university classrooms, which actually look more like this right now. And in addition to physical programs, universities and higher ed companies are opening online programs to accommodate more students. And at the same time, companies are also growing professional training programs to better support their employees' career choices.
Hey, I'm sorry, Dr. Wang, we're not able to see your slides anymore.
Oh. So let me see. Is it, I think it might be because there is a lag. Let me stop sharing and maybe resharing again.
Okay, no problem. Okay, we're good there.
Are you able to see it now?
Oh, yeah, I am seeing it, but it is like you said, there is a lag. It's like it's a delayed while they're loading, like the images are loading. Yes, they are up, and I would hate to interrupt, but I'll let you know if they go away again.
Great, thank you. And for all of these educational service providers, one challenge to meet the demand is to scale these education opportunities while maintaining or improving their quality. And to illustrate this challenge a bit more, maximizing system scalability and quality are sometimes at odds. For example, in one-on-one tutoring, students may receive individualized feedback. However, this doesn't scale. Another example is that in MOOC lecture videos, on the one hand, it makes lectures easily scalable. On the other hand, it doesn't provide interactive forms of learning by doing, which was found to produce higher quality learning. And let's look at another example. Open-ended assignments or projects are frequently given in college classrooms. They often require lots of efforts on grading and offering feedback from instructors. That's hard to scale. We explore alternative formats of assignment questions with the goal of achieving quality and scale at the same time. We know that multiple choice questions are naturally scalable since they can be automatically graded and provide real-time feedback to students. However, how to create multiple choice questions that can exercise higher order thinking and achieve the same level of learning benefits as open-ended assignments? And today I will talk about one example which is a technique that support instructors in semi-automatically creating high-quality multiple choice questions by leveraging existing students' written solutions. And I will illustrate how this technique works in the context of learning heuristic evaluation, which is a usability inspection method in user interface design. And I will now take a minute to explain what is heuristic evaluation. So in Gmail, after I immediately send an email, I got this interface that says message sent with an undo button. And this is an example interface that supports the rule of user control and freedom, because users have the freedom to undo this action if they accidentally hit the send button. And if we look at another example on eBay, on the purchase page, the only option for users is to buy, and there are no access for users if they decide to shop more. And this is an example that violates the rule of user control and freedom. Okay, so I hope you get a basic understanding of what is heuristic evaluation. And when I teach this topic to students in a college class on user research methods, what I would do is I would assign an open-ended assignment to students, and in which I ask them to go find 5 web design features that violate certain web design heuristics and explain why. And this would be the traditional open-ended assignment we give students, and this is an example student solution in response to this assignment question. You can see a screenshot from a PDF file a student submitted, and let's zoom in a little bit. So first, here is a web design feature that the student found. It's a checkout page on eBay. And then they describe this design violates the rule of user control and freedom. And then they explain this is because the website didn't offer an emergency exit. So this is the student submitted assignment in response to this assignment prompt. So our system upgrade uses this previous student submission as input and segments it into 3 components, including a web design feature, a rule violation, and an explanation for this rule violation. And then the system will restructure these components to produce multiple choice questions. So a target multiple choice questions produced would be like this. Here is a web design feature. And the question asks, which of the following Nielsen's heuristic rule does it violate? The original student's answer is used as the correct answer, and the distractors are selected from the pool of answers offered to similar problems written by other students. And additionally, the original student's explanation on why this design violated the rule is used as feedback for this multiple choice question. So following the example, here's an overview of how the workflow of upgrade. Upgrade is averaging the capabilities of both humans and the machine. So past students function as a crowd that offers data source which is the assignment responses that they submitted. And then we use a machine to segment, select, and reorganize examples. And finally, the expert validates the questions in the end for quality control. Now I will explain each step in details. By the way, are you able to see the slides now? Okay.
Yes.
Great. So step 1 almost happens naturally. Past students' written solutions are logged. They can be logged in PDF formats or through online forms. And in step 2, the system segments the written solutions into components based on the assignment template, for example, through keyword extraction. And in this example, the student assignment is segmented into these 3 components, including web design feature, rule violation, and reason. In step 3, we ask the instructor to specify a question creation schema in which they would specify which components in the source will be used in the target question. For example, the source answer web design feature is used as the target question. And the source answer, which is a rule violation, is used as the target correct answer. And then the machine can select incorrect answers from the pool of answers in the database. And lastly, the source answer, which is the student authored explanation, can be used as the feedback for the target question. And an important step in this workflow is to select distractors. In step 3, the system reorganizes the source data based on the schema to create multiple choice questions. And as I said, one critical step is to select distractors. We apply 2 text processing techniques to select distractors based on the instructor's input. First, We computed the similarity between the correct answer and the pool of answers and picked the plausible answers that were most similar to the correct but were incorrect. And second, we also see that instructors, they prefer to use generic answers than specific answers as distractors to prevent students from getting the correct answer by matching keywords or surface features. And we also computed an abstractness score for the answers and prioritized those that were more generic. So after step 4, our system is able to create a large question bank. And in the last step, we ask instructors to select questions from the large question pool. For this one question schema with past student solutions in one offering of the course, which includes only 100 students, we created nearly 500 multiple choice questions just for this one learning objective. And the instructor's job now is just to say yes, no, maybe to these questions and perhaps make edits when necessary until they find enough to deliver. We now see that this is a technique which sources existing students' written solutions and then produce multiple choice questions at scale. And now we want to look at, are the questions produced by Upgrade helpful for learning? And I will now introduce 2 experiments in 2 classrooms that we evaluated the learning benefit of Upgrade produced multiple choice questions. In the first study, we investigate effects of using Upgrade on students' conceptual understanding. This experiment was done in a college research methods course with 28 students. So we divided the whole class into 2 groups, group A and B. In the first week, they are learning about survey design. And in the second week, they are learning about heuristic evaluation. And then for each group, they either did the traditional open-ended assignment, for example, design a survey from scratch, or they worked on the Upgrade-produced multiple choice question assignment. And then we measured the learning outcomes through a quiz that is composed of both multiple choice and open-ended questions. To provide a little more context on the Upgrade-generated multiple choice assignment, the questions produced by Upgrade are rendered through a web-based platform, and students would log into the system to complete the assignment. As you can see, this is an example question asking which of the following heuristic is violated, and the system offers real-time feedback to the student's answer. As a result, we found that students learned the same through both conditions. The lighter bar here is Upgrade, and the darker bar here is the traditional condition where the students did business as usual open-ended assignments. You might see that the trend is slightly favoring, but the difference isn't significant. On the other hand, we do see a significant time reduction between the 2 conditions. The average time students spent on their open-ended assignment was 6.5 hours, and when they use Upgrade, it was reduced to 4.5 hours. This suggests that students learned as much with Upgrade as traditional open-ended assignments in 30% less time. We also got feedback from the instructor of the course, and she mentioned that there's benefit on saving grading efforts because the assignment is automatically graded. And she also had a very interesting suggestion that to use Upgrade as a precursor to open-ended tasks. For example, she said, when students are asked to design a survey, when they didn't actually know how to do it, many assignments turned in were in very bad shape, and they had to tell the students to go back and redo it. And she actually suggested future practice could get students learn with Upgrade first and then go off to generate new content. And we actually did another evaluation study in another college course with 89 students with a goal to see whether practicing with Upgrade can improve students' authentic performance on open-ended tasks. And similarly, we divide the class into 2 groups, and they either learn with Upgrade or learn with traditional approaches. And then we compared their performance on an open-ended project. As a result, we found that students' performance on these storyboard projects significantly increased after using Upgrade. We got some feedback from instructors on the quality of questions produced by Upgrade. And for example, one instructor said, When I write multiple choice questions myself, the distractors I write tend to be obvious and easy. In this approach, I see more plausible distractors. Even I have to think about which one is correct, which is good. And also, the instructors also make suggestions on how we may create better quality multiple choice questions using this approach in the future. Okay, I want to share a major takeaway from this development process. The major takeaway is that the close collaboration between humans and the machine is the key to success in this case. With instructors alone, when they are writing questions, it's hard for them to write lots of elaborated good examples and wrong answers. And we also see that there are many existing work on automatic question generation techniques. We realize that with machine alone, they also only produce fact questions and they are not flexible. And in our case, past peers offer a powerful data source which provide structured examples, and they also provide common errors that students may have, which are important learning goals for the students. With this better data input, machine can auto-select and filter and reorganize examples. In this process, instructors communicating their needs, such as I want similar examples, I want technical answers, to guide the machine in selecting examples. In the end, the instructor would check information accuracy and comprehensiveness to make sure the question quality is good. And this altogether supports the creation of quality learning opportunities for learners. However, in this process, we also observe scenarios that the technique doesn't work very well, which points to future directions. In fact, we found that the success of upgrade is associated with the quality of data input. For example, when we have structured examples and feedback on these examples, upgrade would produce higher quality content. We suggest future pathways for experts to actively collect better examples and design activities so that students are self-annotating their own examples, and these can all serve as better input for the machine for further processing. And also we can explore a more diverse range of learning activities created using this approach. For example, collaborative activity, peer instruction problems, etc. Okay, to summarize, as I continue this work on AI augmented learning experience authoring, I hope to explore a diverse range of data sources. In Upgrade, we use students' written solutions. It's also possible to leverage students' conversations, for example, and their Q&A in forums, and maybe teacher feedback to students. These data sources are powerful because they contain information on students' common errors and struggles. They provide authentic, relatable examples to a diverse student population. And they may also contain information about feedback provided by instructors to address these struggles. And then we can use human AI collaborative approaches to support instructors in creating effective learning experiences. And this is not limited to multiple choice problems. This may also include collaborative problems, branching scenarios, role plays, etc. Yeah, thank you everyone. And this is the end.
Thank you so much for that. That was awesome. I learned a lot of things that I had never known myself. So learning analytics is for sure a broad field. We do have a few questions that folks asked about the Upgrade software that you're using. Are the questions in there, have they been tested for validity and reliability? And are you noticing a difference between the multiple choice questions and the open-ended questions? Things like that about using that.
Yes, we actually did. In the first experiment, we did some validity check, like using IRT models and other like psychometrics methods to see whether the questions are are consistent in measuring student ability. So in the first round, when for one objective, we created about 500 questions, and we randomly picked 30 on them. And as I remember, the Chromebox Alpha was about 0.7, which is pretty reasonable. But later on, as we, I think the one reason that the internal validity is very high on that course was that the data source was pretty good. As I work with other courses, there were cases where the question qualities are bad. And in those cases, we just need more instructor input, like especially in the last step for instructors to finally make the judgment call on which questions they believe they are comfortable sharing with the class. So in this quality control space, I think there are two ways to do it. One is this data-driven way through psychometrics. Another is through expert control. So as I work on this project, I realized a lot of the times completely rely on data isn't enough. Sometimes we really need to have to bring in expert in the process to make sure the quality is high. And I think then the research question becomes because experts have limited time, how can we present the data in a form that would consume minimal time and effort from experts to make the quality control? I think that's how can we do human in the loop like AI? And I think this is a future direction I'm interested in exploring.
Gotcha. And is the upgrade software, is that available to the public to use?
So I would love to explore collaboration. Currently, it's not open source, but if anyone wants to use, please send me an email. I'm very happy to help you set it up. And also, I think this could help me collect more data and do more research. So I'm very excited, and I'm actually looking forward to use this in other universities or contexts. So please definitely send me an email.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And we'll filter through a few more of the questions and see if Dr. Wang can answer them via text for you all. So thank you again.
Thank you.
We are going to move on to our last presenter. We have James Russell, Dr. James Russell, who is the Senior Director of Research Support and Assurance at Unizin. So thank you. You're still muted.
My apologies. Thank you, Amber. Wonderful to be here. I am, again, James Russell, the Senior Director for Research Support and Assurance for Unizin. And I focus primarily on facilitating the productive use of the Unizin data platform, the UDP, what I'll be really focusing on today, through our data services and solution team for our member institutions. So what is Unizin? Unizin is a member-based consortium of 13 R1 institutions that looks to enable members to plan, manage, and scale the digital transformation of an academic mission focused on student success. And the UDP plays a key role for member institutions in that it provides an aggregated and normalized data warehouse. And this is really key to what the data pipeline is. It's really a data pipeline of learner and learning environment data, animating learning analytics at scale. So one of the potentials is a cross-disciplinary approach to really broaden the analytics. What is central to what Unizin and UDP seek to do, and it's an ongoing process built on growing maturity of our platform, really to the development and expansion of the Unizin Common Data Model, the UCDM, the backbone of what we do. And the engagement of our data services and solution team is to bridge the gap between the plethora of learning tool and learning environment data and better knowledge of learners, learning processes, and learning environments. So Unizin's value proposition hinges, I think, on three primary areas: building partnerships, leveraging tools and data. Unizin maintains partnerships with vendors, technology partners, and publishers that allow us to build on and establish standards, and that's key to what we do. Leverage consortium level pricing for learning tools and the data they generate. And that's a circular reinforcing conversation that we have. Providing diversity of content. Unizin leverages the purchasing power again of the consortium to provide affordable access to digital course materials and learning tools, and the data, most importantly, that they generate that are powering the online future of higher education. And then finally, capturing data from the learning environment. Built again on standards, the Unizin data platform provides the infrastructure to integrate and scale data-informed digital learning ecosystems. In short, we build institutional and technology partner incentives to adopt and integrate learning tools and content toward better understanding of learners, learning processes, and learning environments. So in terms of the Unizin data platform, the UDP, Unizin relies on learning tool and strategic partners to deliver, structure, and house the data that lands in the UDP. We ingest data from approximately 100 learning tools, standard through IMS Global Caliper and the Unizin Common Data Model. Those are our two standards that we use. That represents what we believe to be a comprehensive ontology of learners, learning environments, learning behaviors, learning processes. And the UDP relies itself on the Google Cloud Platform environment, providing a host of tools to ingest, that is all coming into the GCP environment, house and analyze learner and learning environment data. So at a very high level, the UDP accomplishes, I think, three main goals. It unifies the teaching and learning data ecosystem, integrate, aggregates, and import all data from across the teaching and learning tool ecosystem. And this is really key to what we do. Through a series of key maps, we aggregate from many and multiple sources. Commonly model and coalesce and unify all data, and that's this normalizing all data and unify it into a single dynamic view of learners, learning processes, and learning environments. And then a data marts and services layer on top of that. Deliver both a data pipeline and a layer of data marts. Those are really purposed queries and services to integrate into institutional practices and tools. So data from the student information system, for example, at member institutions, which represents data that changes infrequently. You can see infrequent change to the left, such as high school transcripts, semester or grades, term grades, and demographic information. We integrate learning management data in the middle and teaching tool data such as Kaltur or Top Hat, which changes frequently, which may, like the LMS, provide real-time events that might be emitted every second or processed through a transformational pipeline into the UDP. So the UDP ingests or receives two types of data, context data and event data. Context data is rich and descriptive and describes learners or learning environments and their relationships. We get data about courses, its sections and modules, and assignments, such as assignment being in relation or assigned to a particular student. So again, relational and rich in description. So as an example, the user object or student record might have first name, last name, high school GPA, and a range of descriptive attributes around that student, most likely derived from the SIS, race and gender and ethnicity. Context data in a course would have a list of all the modules, assignments, titles of quizzes, contents of the quizzes, pages, the rich descriptive data those applications use to create the experiences that faculty or students see in the LMS or whatever learning tool may be used. Context data conforms to the Unizin data model, again, a standard for context data that Unizin created, which in turn represents, in our view, again, an extensive picture of the universe of learners and learning environments. The second category of data is what we call behavior, event, or clickstream data. And this data describes discrete actions of instructors or learners or teaching assistants, and sometimes even the tools themselves in the learning environment. And these tend to be thin on description, such as James submitted an assignment, or started a video, or paused a video, or a file was deleted. These events enter the UDP in what is called a JSON, a JavaScript object notation format, which conform again to the IMS Global Caliper standard. So while these two forms of data are distinct in nature and kind, they are complementary. Context data provide literally the context you need to interpret the behaviors of learners in the learning environment. So looking a bit closer at the structure of the UDP, we find the underlying Unizin Common Data Model, UCDM. It is designed to represent, again, context data in a relational way, and this shows in a broad sense that just a slice of the relationships that are built. That is as inclusive of learners and learning environments as we can construct. The UCDM, in essence, is a data dictionary, represented here as an ERD, or entity relationship diagram, that brings together in groups under 70 what we believe logical entities representing primary concepts as unique tables, associated through primary keys, shown here as the PK reference tags, and foreign keys, FK tags. Each entity or table is made up of elements or attributes or fields, which are the granular source of queries that researchers or analysts create to model analytics. So within the course offering entity, that table, we have grouped together information elements related to a course, such as created date or syllabus content or available credits. And in turn, the course offering entity is connected through one of its foreign keys called academic session ID to the academic session table, whose primary key is, of course, academic session ID. For an event or behavioral data, the UDP relies on, again, on the INS Global Caliper standard, which is designed to capture events or behaviors within the LMS or associated tools as they happen and transmit them to the UDP in real time. Most of our dashboards and reporting instruments or queries that we refresh, we do that on an hourly basis. If learning tools conform to and emit Caliper events, the UDP is poised to receive them. So for the event pictured here, we have a JSON event that Susan Smith is the actor, the student, who has a role of learner and is in a course offering of Biology 101, who posted a message to a discussion. When the event is emitted to what is called a Caliper endpoint in the UDP, this JSON event is unpacked in tabular form in a similar way described above, and then enriched with context data so that all the previous events and context associated with Susan Smith can be represented and remain connected. And this is really kind of the beauty of what the UDP offers. All of that rich behavior, which is given depth through additional SIS and LMS context data, is captured and transmitted to the UDP as they occur. So in looking at the primary areas of research and analytics broadly applied to the UDP, we might begin with the following. Learning analytics, measuring and analyzing learners and learning environments for the purpose of optimizing learning and learning environments. The kinds of work we've seen in this area include developing course design metrics, or to do comparative course metrics to understand the efficacy of course design, research around topic and sentiment analysis culled from writing content, and analysis of behavioral data and interaction data to be able to optimize the content presented to students. Educational data mining field tends to focus on the application of large-scale data mining techniques from other disciplines to educational data and applying statistical techniques such as topic extraction and social network analysis. Intervention research, and in particular measuring the effects of course designs or teaching and learning practices in an experimental setting, again evaluating the efficacy of course design or redesign and teaching and learning practices, and evaluating the impact on outcomes of advisor interventions involving advising practices or student coaching practices. In terms of DEI and longitudinal research, we're also seeing a deeper understanding of the learning experience through the data provided through the UDP, being able to see what's happening in assessments and assessment-based experiences and student-to-student interactions, the rich behavioral experiences that happen at a course, opens up really a new information for institutional research offices and their existing interest in equity, diversity, and inclusion in policy. Classification and prediction, developing machine learning models, for example, that classify outcomes and predict outcomes is certainly a growing area of interest. The focus is often on risk assessment, depending on what one defines as risk, lack of engagement or activity or low completion rates. or for example, using behavior data to train machine learning models to which you then feed current behavior data or course grades to predict outcomes. And then finally, advising and decision support involves, again, models of learning behavior to measure risk of a disengagement, underperformance, low grade flagging to drive advisor or coach priorities. Areas of focus involve the development of visualizations and dashboards using learning data, faculty-facing learning analytics and measures intended to inform reflection, student-facing analytics intended to foster reflection, metacognition, critical thinking. Indeed, a great example of such an application is MyLa, or My Learning Analytics, that was developed at the University of Michigan and is hosted by Unizin. So how do researchers from member institutions conduct analytics using the UDP? We can do it a number of ways, and a number of researchers and groups within our member institutions work locally. The best in practice or place in our view is the cloud for both performance and security purposes. As I mentioned earlier, the UDP is built in the Google Cloud environment, and it draws on the tools in Google BigQuery listed on the left, which include a query builder, Jupyter Notebooks, AutoML for machine learning based analytics, and Data Studio for visualizations. And that in turn is connected to Google Cloud SQL, where the batch ingest of all context data occurs, and to which event data that streams into BigQuery can be connected. So we have two sort of hemispheres of those or data stores within the UDP. So the Unizin Data Services and Solutions team provides that bridge for member institutions to navigate the UDP and receive training on how to translate the UCDM into meaningful research in analytics. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. We do have a few questions in the Q&A for you. They're about your the data map that you showed. They're wondering how many Canvas tables are in the data map and what SIS or SIS tables are included. You're still muted.
Thank you. For context data, the ERD diagram represents about 800 individual elements in about 70 entities or tables. And that organization that's represented in that small section of ERD that we provide is we believe, comprehensive representation of learners, learning environment, learning processes. Within that context data representation, we have both SIS and LMS data, that is context data. For event data, it is a separate feed into the UDP that captures, based on every tool and every of the 100 or so tools that we have, each sends events in a particular way, in a different way, in a unique way, but they are consolidated, aggregated, and unpacked, as it were, and fed in alignment in relation to context data when they're ingested within the UDP. So we can get everything from when a quiz was graded to when a student, how much time a student spent in a particular tool, answers to discussions, so forth and so on. All of those sort of behaviors that are context dependent.
Okay, and I will ask one last question of the group before we're done today. If you could briefly tell me, what are some of the challenges, biggest challenges you're seeing right now in learning analytics, and ways that we're trying to overcome them?
Well, I can jump in just from a functional standpoint, and that is we are almost victims of riches, in that I think a lot of researchers and in particular institutional research is understanding what's available, not necessarily only within the UDP, but what is given the shift to online teaching and the plethora of data, that we're really challenged to meet and make sense of, in particular, the UCDM, and apply it to the incredible questions that we're addressing in many ways on a daily basis. So that again, that bridging the gap between data and knowledge is a considerable challenge and exciting.
I'll go next, unless, I don't know, shoot, do you want to like play rock, paper, scissors? Or, okay. I think that this is not controversial. It's something that has been talked about a lot in learning analytics circles. One of the biggest challenges that I think that learning analytics faces is being attendant to theory. So there's been criticisms of learning analytics that large aspects of it are atheoretic and maybe favoring quick wins or simple demonstrations over trying to like build an understanding or a knowledge base that's concordant to a field and that could actually improve practice. This is a byproduct of the fact that learning analytics is an interdisciplinary enterprise. So yeah, which theory should we use, and whose methods for building that theory should be adopted are fair reasons that theory has been sometimes lacking. But I also think that it's the only salvation for an academic discipline if we're building some generalizable knowledge or something that we would expect to be able to make precise predictions in new contexts. So yeah, that's my take.
Yeah, I'll go next. I think one area I'm really excited about learning analytics is how we can use learning analytics to help instructors in their design processes. So if we reflect on our experiences teaching courses, I know that there's so much work on learning analytics and educational data mining working on, but when I'm designing an assignment prompt, I basically just open a Google Doc and then start drafting there without any support. And I'm teaching an undergrad course right now. I'm constantly having this question, which has been taught like more than 10 years, but I'm constantly having this question: do I go too fast? Do I go slow? Whether the problems are at the appropriate difficulty level for the students. So I think there is this gap that there are so many research on this, but for instructors or like maybe learning experience designer who are actually developing these learning experiences, we do not take full advantage of the learning analytics research I have. So I'm really interested in like kind of bridging this gap between how we can extract information from useful knowledge from data and how we can use these data and analytics to help instructors and educators make instruction decisions and help them develop better learning experiences for students.
I'll go last. In some ways, what Ben expressed is what I would express too. And the one extension that I put there, and then I'll say something else, is that I think we have a lot of theory already. And the problem is not so much that we don't have enough theory, but that we need to now use the new opportunities afforded by learning analytics, by technology in classrooms, and use that to test the theory that we have and to test its limits and to understand under what conditions does it play out the way we think, and under what conditions do we need some alternative theory to be used here, or do we need to make modification? I think that is the real big opportunity here. The one caveat, and you asked for a challenge, is that you know, we need to be careful about how we present this to people who might be involved, to stakeholders. I teach a class of 140 students on learning analytics. And the most fascinating week is the week on ethics, and especially the ethics of experimentation. Students have very different opinions on whether it is okay or not to experiment in a classroom, especially once you ask the question about themselves. What if I randomize you to different homeworks and see which one teaches you the best? And so I think there's a real opportunity to do research into how to not just do the research well, but how to present it to the stakeholders in ways that are attractive, that bring them on as participants on this journey, and make sure that students feel good about being part of it and develop a scientific mindset, which especially during a pandemic is a good thing to have, about being part of research and pushing the science forward of how learning works and how it can be best implemented in classrooms.
Wow, that was awesome. Thank you all so much. I want to be respectful of your time as well as the time of our attendees. So again, this webinar has been recorded and the slides and the video link will be shared. I really enjoyed speaking with you all and I will be in touch again soon. Please, attendees, visit the peersdatahub.com or .web, www.peersdatahub.net if you want more information or to register for future webinars. Thank you all so much.